All right, welcome. I'm Dane Frew, and we are here kicking off season 2 of Divorce Unplugged. Geoff, how are you?
Hello, Dane. Good to see you, and welcome back to both of us, I think. So, season one closed a few weeks ago, and here we are launching our new season.
Yes, no, it's good to get back into it. Another few weeks of interesting topics to cover.
Very wide range, as always.
All right, well, we'll get into it, shall we?
Let's do it.
So, on the back of our first season, we do have a wide-ranging group of people watching and listening to this podcast across the country and across the world, which is great. So, I know you've mentioned to me recently that there's a fairly there's a shift in a word and a saying called the grey divorce. Can you explain that to me and to the listeners a little bit more about what that's about?
I can. The issue of the grey divorce now is a term that's come into popularity a little bit because what we're seeing in Australia is there is a growing trend that people who actually separate and ending their marriage are actually getting older. So, and we're getting a lot more older people who are separating and then having to look at the issues of divorce and property settlement.
So, what are the statistics around this that support that saying of a grey divorce?
So we have about 50,000 divorces in Australia every year, and that's been a fairly consistent trend for about 10 years. But if you go back 10 years ago, only was 1 in 5 Australians over 50 formed that category of people. So in simple maths, about 10,000 of those 50,000 divorces were people over 50. But now it's actually 1 in 4, so it's a much larger percentage.
So overall, has that impacted the average age of divorce across the country?
It has. So over the last 5 years in a row, we've actually seen a gradual trend, so that the average age of a divorce is now actually at 42.
And what's that been previously?
Oh, it was in the early low 40s, and it's crept up almost a couple of years, literally in 5 years.
Yeah, right. So what are some of the implications for older Australians if they are separating and dividing their assets?
Well, there's a couple of really important things to think about, and when you have a grey divorce or people coming to the end of either they've retired or they're coming to the end of their earning lives, is that there's a finite pool of assets ultimately that they have to divide.
Yeah, and what sort of assets are we talking about there?
Well, they're a little bit different from when you're early into your marriage. Early in your marriage, you might have a house with a mortgage and a few dollars in the bank, and you're acquiring furniture and other things. But when you're getting towards retirement age, most people will then have some substantial superannuation. They've probably got a house that they've paid off, and they're looking at other investment funds that need to be dealt with.
So we've spoken about superannuation on previous podcast episode, and you've written a couple of really interesting blogs up on the website about it as well. What are the main concepts around that splitting of superannuation?
Well, there's two things about superannuation I could touch on. There's superannuation that's still in a lump sum form, I could call it, that people haven't started accessing. So if you've got $300,000 in superannuation you've accumulated over your 25 or 30 years of working life, or even longer, that has to be divided, and it's quite a large number. But the other part of superannuation is that when you've reached the retirement age, what a lot of people have then converted their superannuation into an ongoing pension fund or basically an income stream rather than a lump sum, which they then are supposed to be receiving for the rest of their life. And then how do you deal with that when you've actually separated?
So what about the other major assets that exist, like the house or any other investments?
Well, as I mentioned, the difference between a grey divorce and we'll call it a regular divorce is that in the grey divorce situation, there are generally much more substantial assets, and a lot of them are in fixed assets such as the matrimonial home or the beach house and the like.
So what are the specific risks that are associated and that you see in separation for older Australians?
Well, the danger we have with older Australians at separation is that there's only, as I've said, the finite pool of assets. And what happens if that pool isn't big enough to support both parties? You're not in a position to rebuild your financial futures at that stage, and you run risk of even ending up living with the children.
So what can the result of that be?
Well, hardship essentially, both both not just to the separating couple, but the extended family. So, quite often we'll see the children needing to intervene or assist their parents in the event of a separation at an older age.
So would older Australians document their property settlement in the same way as perhaps maybe younger Australians would?
They can. So we've talked about in previous podcasts about the issue of doing some consent orders filed with the court. But what we see far more often now is the other form of documenting their agreements, which is called a binding financial agreement.
So what is a bond? What was it? Sorry,
A binding financial
binding
agreement.
financial agreement. I can't even say it, let alone know what it is. So can you explain what it is and why someone would use it?
So yes, I can. So in lawyer land, everyone calls it a BFA for short, so we don't get confused. But the BFA basically is a document which is prepared like a contract between the parties and which is vetted by lawyers on both sides, which can be more flexible than what a consent order might be. And it's more flexible in a couple of ways. It can deal with assets that the court might think is a little bit unbalanced, but it might be practically more pragmatic for the family to sort out their assets in that way. It deals with things like spousal maintenance, which is money to be paid from one party to the other, and it can deal with the assets in a more flexible way generally.
So you mentioned before about how older Australians could support themselves while separating. Can separation have an impact on someone's pension?
Yes. So in a classic scenario, there are two types of pensions. The first one I mentioned before is that sort of superannuation style or investment pension that you get. But the one that gets impacted, of course, is that if you're eligible for a government pension, obviously a couple receives X dollars, but if you are separated, then you receive Y dollars. And so there are pension impacts across the board, which can be positive or negative depending on which style of pension it is.
So are there any other unusual factors or features when dealing with separation for older Australians?
Well, we have one, and it's a bit of an elephant in the room for the legal industry, I think, and also how courts deal with that. And we have the unusual situation now that there's a number of cases that have come through the family court, and its related courts that deal with where one party has actually lost capacity. And if they're in a nursing home, I'll give you a scenario. So here I am, husband and wife, married for 45 years. Dad's got dementia. He's ended up in a nursing home. Mum's still living in the former matrimonial home. And the question then becomes, are they legally separated? And there are some times and some circumstances where the children of those parties may intervene and say that they are, and actually force a property settlement or a divorce or separation, even though that may have never been their intention.
Right, so things could get complicated in an instance like that.
Very complicated. The worst case scenario I can give you is usually second marriages. So you might have the case where dad, as I've said, is maybe in his 70s or his 80s. He's had to go into a nursing home, but he's in his second marriage for 10 years with his second wife. And the children from his first marriage might want her out and basically then force a property settlement rather than an inheritance situation if he dies. And they're the ones that are driving some of these matters to court, not dad in the nursing home.
Right, so it's the kids that are creating the trouble, like they did in the first place.
Well, it happens. Kids have caused trouble at many different ages, and I think this is a new nuance of that problem.
All right, interesting. And I hadn't heard of the grey divorce before, so it's good to know that I guess the service is there for anybody and everybody that needs it. So good chat on that topic.
It is, and I think the important thing, just summarising about grey divorces, is that because you've got complexities like pensions and you've got larger asset pools, it may well be necessary to involve the whole family, including children if necessary, to make sure that you're getting the best advice and end up with the best possible outcome in the unfortunate circumstance of a late age separation.
Yep. Good advice as always. All right, on to the people's favourite part of the episode, and that's our health topic. And you always come up with some magic there, Geoff. What do we got for this episode?
Well, I think today's topic relates to people who find it hard to get things done or procrastinate. And it's a wonderful article. I'll just make a reference to it. It's by a fellow called Adam Mastriani, and it was released in January of this year. And it's an article called "So You Want to Debog Yourself."
Right. So can you give us some background on what it's about?
So Adam, and we'll put this article in the show notes, but he wrote a wonderful article that basically talks about why do we have problems in getting things done or finding ourselves on the right path. And then using those strategies if you can understand why you get bogged, as he describes it, then you can use those strategies to unbog yourself generally.
So can you give us some examples on how these problems arise?
Absolutely. So I'm more than happy to. So he talks about, well, why do we get sort of on the wrong track, for example? So he talks about the concept of gutter balling, which is an unusual phrase, but he refers to it where someone invites you to join in on a project that you're not quite really interested in, and it's not quite your alignment. So you're rolling along like a bowling ball down the lane, and you end up close to the pins is where you want to go, but you end up ultimately in the gutter simply because you've chosen the wrong project.
Yeah. So what about creating your own personal bogs? Because everyone gets stuck down in their own rut from time to time.
They do, and he looks at what goes through your head, for example, that you might be looking for the perfect opportunity, and it never arises. So you just continually refuse to move forward in life because everything has to be 100% aligned before you take a risk, so to speak. So he's got that effect called the infinite effort illusion, for example, and he talks about that, or blaming God. So why isn't there enough time in the day? Why isn't there 25 hours of time? So it's a really interesting exposition about identifying 8 or 9 really key concepts about why you can get yourself lost in the mud, so to speak.
So are there any bad escape plans?
There are. There's a couple, actually. There's the try harder fallacy, which is, he talks about simply saying, well, I'll get myself out of this bog simply by trying harder more and more. When reality is that if you're going the wrong path in the first place, that's not going to get you to the end point you want to receive.
Yeah. So does the author offer any rays of light in how to get out of this bog?
He does. So what he does is he sort of turns it back at the end of the article towards looking at those 7 or 8 key problems that either are external to you or that are basically in your own mind. And he says, well, look, before you launch into anything, go back and analyse why you're stuck where you are, and are you actually using one of those bogging tools to slow yourself down? And if you can, once you understand that that's the case, then you can take the steps to step around that and get yourself moving forward.
All right. Well, we will link that article in the show notes so everyone can go and have a read of that themselves and come up with their own ideas. But yeah, thanks, Geoff, again for that health topic, and thank you for your thoughts again around the grey divorce. And it was good to have you back, and good to get episode 9 done and our first episode of season 2.
It's good to be back, and I just love sharing a little bit of wisdom at the end as well. So hopefully everyone got a little bit out of today. Thanks, Dane.
I'm sure they did. Now, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time on episode 10.